The cafeteria went completely silent the moment, Doctor. Harlan Voss picked up his coffee cup and poured it slowly, deliberately over the head of the woman standing in front of him. Not an accident, not a slip, a choice. She didn't scream, didn't move, just stood there while dark liquid dripped from her hair onto her scrubs, her hands open at her sides, her breathing so controlled it looked mechanical. Harlan Voss smiled. He thought that was the end of it. He had no idea he had just made the worst decision of his career, and that the woman standing in front of him had once carried out covert medical operations in places that don't appear on any public map. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications, because this channel is where the stories that keep you up at night live. Every week we bring you cinematic tales of people pushed to their limits, dismissed, underestimated, and then when the moment comes, absolutely impossible to ignore. Drop a like on this video if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get into it. The Kellerman Regional Medical Center sat at the western edge of Harwick Falls, Pennsylvania, a city that had once run on steel and now ran on medical services, insurance claims, and the particular quiet pride of a place that had survived losing everything it was built around. 3 campuses, 2 research wings, and a level 2 trauma unit that served 4 surrounding counties. Not glamorous, not the kind of institution that appeared in national rankings or drew residents from Ivy programs chasing prestige. But it handled volume, real emergencies, the kind of cases that arrived without warning and didn't wait for the right specialist to be available. It attracted a specific kind of person, the type who preferred actual work to the appearance of it. Nurse Sarah Langford was exactly that type. She had been on staff at Kellerman for just under 2 years, assigned primarily to the trauma unit on the 3rd floor. 34 years old, white, average height, with a kind of face that didn't announce itself, not because she lacked presence, but because she had learned, over a long period of time, and in much less forgiving environments than this one, to keep that presence contained until she needed it. Her movements were economical. She didn't fidget. She didn't over-explain. In the cafeteria, in the break room, in handoff meetings, she said what was necessary and stopped when it was finished. Some of her colleagues found her unreadable. A few found it reassuring. Most had simply stopped trying to interpret it and had arrived, organically, at a working understanding that Sarah Langford was someone you wanted in the room when things went wrong, and that whatever was happening inside her head was probably not their business. She had spent her first 6 months at Kellerman doing nothing more dramatic than establishing herself, learning the rhythms of the unit, identifying which attending physicians made sound decisions under pressure, and which ones projected confidence while making dangerous choices, building patient trust through the slow accumulation of reliability, showing up, following through, remembering things that mattered. She had not tried to stand out. She had tried to be useful, which was a different thing entirely. Approach had worked until Dr. Harlan Voss decided it hadn't. Voss was 49, broad through the shoulders, with a face that photographed well and a personality that had never been told, convincingly or consequentially, that it needed to change. He had trained at Penn, published in 3 journals, and built a procedure record in cardiothoracic surgery that was, objectively, strong. He was the kind of surgeon that hospital administrators pointed to in funding presentations, the name that added weight to a program, the resume line that made a department look serious. He was also, by near unanimous informal consensus among nursing staff, one of the most systematically unpleasant people in the building. Not in a dramatic way, not in a way that was easy to formally document on any single occasion. He was unpleasant in the incremental, structural way of people who have enough institutional authority to operate just below the threshold of what anyone will formally address the small humiliations, the strategic dismissals, the habit of making people feel that their presence in a room was a minor administrative inconvenience. He had targeted Sarah almost from her first month on the trauma rotation. Began the way it always began with people like him, small enough to seem like nothing. He corrected her in front of patients on matters that didn't require correction. He asked her questions during rounds in the tone of someone who already knew she'd fail them. When she gave handoff reports, he'd listen for approximately 8 seconds and then turn to the attending as if she hadn't spoken, repeating her information slightly rephrased, as though he'd just generated it himself. He called her the floor support in front of attending physicians on 2 separate occasions. The second time, within earshot of her patient, a term that was technically defensible and deliberately degrading in context. She had filed a concern report with the charge nurse 8 months ago. It produced a conversation, a follow-up email she never received, and no change. She had spoken directly to the floor supervisor 4 months later and had been told with genuine, well-meaning incompetence that Voss was direct and that she might benefit from communicating more assertively. She had submitted a formal written complaint to the department head 3 months after that. She received an acknowledgement of receipt within 48 hours. Nothing followed, nothing changed. So Sarah had done what she always did. When the formal mechanism failed to move in any direction, she adapted. She documented everything, not obsessively, not visibly, but consistently, with dates, exact language, and a running record stored in a personal encrypted file that nobody at Kellerman knew existed. Kept her interactions with Voss brief and professional. She didn't take the bait when he spoke over her. She didn't react visibly when he made the kinds of general observations about nursing staff that were designed to sting, without being specific enough to quote. She endured it with a patience that had nothing to do with acceptance and everything to do with the particular disciplines and everything to do with the particular discipline of someone who had learned the difference between when to act and when to wait. She was waiting. The Tuesday morning of the incident began without ceremony. The cafeteria filled up at 7:15. With the shift change, crowd day, nurses arriving, overnight staff finishing, residents pulling coffee before rounds, a handful of attendings moving through with the slightly compressed energy of people whose actual day had already started an hour ago. The room had the familiar institutional noise of it, chairs on linoleum, someone's phone alarm going unanswered in a jacket pocket, the espresso machine cycling behind the service counter, the low overlap of a dozen separate conversations. Sarah was at the condiment station with a cup of black coffee when she heard his voice behind her. "You put in the wrong dosage for bed 7. She turned. Voss was 3 feet away with a tray, his lanyard swinging, looking not quite at her, slightly past her, which was a habit of his, addressing her in the general direction of her face, without the effort of actual eye contact. "I didn't," she said. He looked at her then. A flat, brief look. "I reviewed the chart this morning. Evening documentation shows 0.9 when it should have been 1.2. It's your notation. It's also Dr. Page's order. I administered what was prescribed. The dosage changed at 1900 hours. I flagged the adjustment and documented the note." She kept her voice even. "If there's a discrepancy in the chart, it comes from the order change, not my documentation." Voss set his tray down on the nearest table, with the specific deliberateness of someone who was controlling the pace of the exchange. "What I'm telling you is that I spent time this morning correcting something that shouldn't have required correction. Then I'd suggest reviewing the full order history before making statements about someone's documentation in a public room," she said. The ripple happened in the 3 seconds after she finished speaking, the awareness spreading outward through the cafeteria, the way it does when a room realizes it's watching something real. Conversations dropped off. People near the condiment station shifted. 2 residents who had been loading their trays at the counter stopped moving. Voss turned toward her very slowly. In 7 months of systematic, low-grade harassment, she had never pushed back directly. Not once. She had been efficient, professional, and completely unreactive, which he had interpreted the way people like him always do, as evidence that she understood her position and would stay in it. "You need to watch your tone," he said. My tone is appropriate. She reached for her coffee. I'd like to get back to the floor. What happened in the next 4 seconds happened without escalation, without raised voices, without any transition that gave the room time to understand what it was about to witness. Harlan Voss reached across the condiment station, picked up his large paper cup nearly full, purchased 2 minutes ago from the counter, and poured it directly and deliberately over Sarah Langford's head. The room did not make a sound. Dark coffee spread through her hair, ran in thin lines down the side of her face, soaked into the collar of her scrubs, dripped from her jaw onto the floor. It was hot enough to sting, not hot enough to cause injury, a detail that would matter later and suggested something about the calculation behind the decision. This wasn't a moment of lost control. Lost control was messier, faster, louder. This was a statement, performed in front of witnesses, by a man who believed his position in the institution made him untouchable. He had wanted her to react, to cry, or shout, or do something that could be reframed afterward as instability. He wanted her to confirm the narrative he had already built, that she was difficult, that she escalated situations, that whatever happened to her in that room had somehow been produced by her own behavior. She didn't give him any of it. Sarah set her coffee cup down on the counter. She reached for a napkin from the dispenser beside her with one hand and pressed it to her face, absorbing the liquid in slow, methodical passes. She blinked, once the only involuntary response she allowed. Then she looked directly at Harlan Voss with an expression so completely controlled that it was, in its way, more uncomfortable than anger would have been. He had expected capitulation or collapse. He got neither. He got her eyes steady, clear, and entirely unimpressed with him. "Know your place," he said. 3 seconds of eye contact. Then she picked up what remained of her things, turned, and walked out of the cafeteria without a word. The room stayed silent after the door swung shut behind her. Not the silence of shock. They had all seen what happened. It wasn't confusing, but the silence of a room trying to process what it meant that a senior attending physician had just done. That, in public, on camera, and was now standing at the condiment station, as if he'd done nothing worth discussing. Darlene Marsh, an overnight nurse with 11 years on the floor, who was in the last 40 minutes of her shift, looked at the space where Sarah had been standing. Then she looked at Voss. Then she took out her phone, walked to the far end of the condiment station, where the liquid had pooled on the floor and on the counter, and photographed it. Voss saw her do it. He said nothing. He picked up his tray and walked to a table. Sarah changed in the third-floor locker room. Stripped off the soaked scrubs, replaced them with the spare set she kept in her locker, not out of paranoia, just the specific preparedness of someone who had spent years in environments where having what you needed before you needed. It wasn't optional. She washed her face at the sink with cold water, dried her hair with paper towels, twisted it back, and secured it. She looked at herself in the mirror once, briefly not checking her expression, just the same inventory habit she'd had for years, a quick read of her own face, to confirm she was present and functional before walking back into whatever was waiting. Then she went to work. The trauma unit was busy. 3 overnight cases had carried into the day shift. Construction accident from Route 12 that had come in at 4 in the morning was still being managed. She took handoff without fanfare, reviewed the active charts, and began her rounds. The floor already knew. She could see it in the angles of people's attention as she moved through the slightly overcareful glances, the specific quality of normalcy that people perform when they've just been talking about something and don't want that to show. Priya, one of the day nurses, was too carefully interested in a supply cart near the nurses' station. Marcus at the monitoring desk looked up at her and then back down at the screen with the unhurried deliberateness of someone making a choice about what to acknowledge. Darlene caught her near the supply room before clocking out. "Took photos of the spill before anyone cleaned it," she said quietly. "Before and after. Also got a still from someone who was recording near the counter." Sarah stopped. "You didn't have to do that." "I know I didn't." Darlene's expression was even. 11 years in this unit. I've watched that man do smaller versions of this to 8 different nurses. Most of them transferred or left. You're the first one I've seen not break." She paused. I figured someone ought to make sure there was a record. Sarah held her gaze for a moment. "Thank you, Darlene." Darlene nodded once and went to clock out. Merritt called Sarah into his office at 9:45. Dr. Oliver Merritt ran the department with the particular management style of someone who had once been a good physician and had since spent 20 years in administration, becoming progressively worse at conflict. He was 61, careful with language, prone to passive constructions, and deeply committed to the institutional stability that required him not to see certain things clearly. Sarah sat across from his cluttered desk with her hands in her lap. "I understand there was an incident this morning," he said. "Dr. Voss poured his coffee on me in the cafeteria, in front of approximately 15 witnesses." Merritt's eyes moved carefully. He's characterized the situation somewhat differently. He's had time to do that. "I haven't spoken to anyone yet, which is why I'm here." He says you spoke to him in a manner he found threatening, and that the situation escalated from there. I corrected an inaccurate claim he made about my documentation, calmly, factually, in front of other people. He responded by pouring a full cup of coffee over my head. She let the sentence sit for a moment. "I'd like to know how correcting a factual error constitutes threatening behavior." Merritt folded his hands, the gesture of a man organizing his thoughts while trying not to say what he was actually thinking. "Dr. Voss is a significant contributor to this department. I'm not disputing his surgical record," Sarah said. "That's not what I'm here to discuss." He stopped. "I've filed 3 formal concerns about Dr. Voss's conduct over the past 8 months, she said. None of them generated a substantive response. What happened this morning was witnessed by a large number of people and was captured on the cafeteria's camera system. She kept her voice neutral. I'd like to understand what the formal next step looks like from your office." Merritt studied her for a moment with the particular look of a man trying to measure how serious a problem he was dealing with. "I'll need to review the footage and consult with HR." "That sounds appropriate," she said. She stood, thanked him, and left. Voss was back on the floor by 11, which confirmed what Sarah had expected, that Merritt's consultation with HR had produced nothing immediate, and that Voss had interpreted the silence as an institutional vote of confidence. He moved through his rounds with his usual authority, speaking at the nurses' stations in a slightly louder voice than necessary, claiming the physical space of the corridor in the way that men who have never been told to shrink themselves do at chemis without noticing. He found her at 1120 outside room 304, writing in a patient chart at the rolling station. He slowed as he passed. He dropped his voice. "Merritt spoke to me," he said. "I've recommended a conduct review for your behavior this morning. It'll be on your file." She looked up from the chart. "You poured coffee on me," she said, "and you spoke to me with a hostility that escalated the situation. 2 sides to everything." He straightened the front of his coat. "This hospital has a structure, Ms. Langford. Knowing where you fit inside it is a professional skill, and from where I'm standing, yours needs some development." He walked away. She capped her pen, finished the notation she had been making before he interrupted, and moved on to the next room. Priya and Marcus had both been close enough to hear. She felt their eyes on her back and didn't turn around. She didn't need to see their expressions to know what was in them, that particular mixture of recognition and dread that builds in people who have watched a situation compound for too long without resolution, and are starting to understand that whatever is coming is going to land on everyone in the room. The afternoon ran the way trauma afternoons run, not a single emergency, but a constant accumulation of smaller ones that built on each other until the floor had a specific electrical quality, the kind of ambient tension that experienced nurses recognize as the thing that precedes either a sudden resolution or a sudden escalation. Sarah, sect? Sarah moved through it without breaking rhythm. A post-surgical patient in room 309 developing a pressure bleed that needed immediate intervention before the surgical team arrived. A 17-year-old from a car accident in imaging whose Glasgow score had begun declining in a way that didn't match the initial presentation. She flagged it before the resident caught it, requested urgent re-imaging, and was documented as having identified it first. A patient in 308 reacting to a medication adjustment that the prescribing resident had cleared without checking the interaction flag she had noted in the chart that morning. 3 catches in one shift, none of them loud, none of them the kind of thing that generates a commendation or a mention in rounds. Just the invisible work of a nurse who was better at her job than the institution had found a way to recognize. She was charting at 4:15 when the call came down from the ER, not a standard incoming. The charge nurse, Everett, took it, and his face changed in a way she noticed from across the station, a tightening, a refocus. He went directly to the attending on duty, Dr. Claire Ashburn, a trauma surgeon in her early 40s who was straightforward and quick and did not operate from ego. Sarah caught the summary from 6 feet away. Military liaison, incoming transport, training-related casualties, nature of injuries partially classified, ETA 12 minutes, requesting trauma bay clearance and full prep. She was already moving before Everett finished the relay. She went to the supply room and began pulling equipment, not the standard set, something more specific, particular gauge range, a portable chest kit, monitoring leads configured for rapid multi-point assessment rather than single patient monitoring. Priya came in behind her and stopped. "How do you know what to pull?" "We don't have the injury report. We have the category," Sarah said, moving along the shelves with a speed and specificity that came from somewhere Priya couldn't identify. That's enough to start with. She wasn't guessing. She was extrapolating from a framework that had nothing to do with Kellerman's standard preparation protocols and everything to do with a specific body of knowledge she had never listed on her nursing resume. Voss appeared in the trauma bay 9 minutes later. Nobody had called him. Nobody needed him. But high-visibility cases were something he moved toward the way certain organisms move toward heat instinctively and with a sense of entitlement that had never been effectively challenged. He positioned himself near the head of the bay and said nothing, watching. The transport came through the bay doors at 4:29. 3 Navy personnel with a gurney, 2 medics in working uniform, and an operator who was conscious, his left side stabilized with field dressing applied before hospital arrival. A 4th figure followed behind them. Navy working uniform, command insignia, the particular physical stillness of someone senior, enough not to need to demonstrate authority through movement. The lead medic gave the handoff in rapid, compressed shorthand, blunt force injury to the lateral thorax during water insertion training, suspected pneumothorax, blood pressure holding at 94/60, but declining, oxygen saturation dropping, field needle decompression performed 11 minutes prior at the training site. Ashburn absorbed it and started directing. Then Voss stepped forward and reached for the field dressing on the patient's left side, barehanded, no gloves, moving with the assumption that his proximity to the gurney constituted authority over it. "Stop." Sarah's voice came out flat and immediate, the kind of tone that doesn't ask for compliance, but expects it. She was already beside the gurney with gloves on, her hands positioning above the dressing with the calm precision of someone who had done this in conditions significantly worse than a hospital trauma bay. Sterile field. The decompression site is open. She looked at the primary medic. Most recent SAT reading, 91, 4 minutes ago. Pre-decompression, 83. She looked at the portable imaging the medics had brought a compressed chest scan run at the training site before transport, slightly degraded quality but readable. She looked at it for 3 seconds with the focused stillness of someone who processed visual medical data quickly and without theatrical deliberation. Then she looked at the patient's position. Then at Ashburn. He has a secondary accumulation on the right, not the primary injury, contracoup effect, from high-velocity water impact. The left decompression is stable, but the right side is building. He drops again in the next 6 to 8 minutes without intervention. The trauma bay went quiet in the specific way it goes quiet, when someone has said something that is either wrong or exactly right, and the room hasn't decided which yet. Ashburn looked at the scan, looked at Sarah. A half-second calculation, not doubt, just the professional due diligence of a surgeon who is about to authorize an intervention. Then, 14 gauge. Get me the kit. Voss started. I don't think that clinicals. She's right. The voice came from the Navy officer standing behind Voss. Everyone in the bay turned. He was looking directly at Sarah, not at Voss, not at Ashburn, at Sarah, with an expression that was not the expression of someone encountering a stranger. You read it from the scan, he said. Not a question, an observation. Like someone identifying a signature they recognized. Sarah met at his eyes. Steady. Contracoup pneumothorax from high-velocity water impact. Yes. The officer held her gaze for 2 seconds longer than the medical situation required. Then he stepped back and let the team work. The decompression took 4 minutes. Clean, efficient, no complications in the procedure. Patient's oxygen saturation began climbing inside 90 seconds. Ashburn confirmed the improvement, ordered repeat imaging, and moved the team into stabilization. Voss stood at the edge of the bay. He had touched nothing. He had contributed nothing. He had been stopped by a nurse, overridden by a Navy officer, and made entirely irrelevant in a situation he had inserted himself into based on the same assumption he always operated from, that his presence in a room was inherently authoritative. He watched Sarah work, really watched her, perhaps for the first time not with the evaluative dismissiveness he normally applied, but with something less comfortable. She moved around the patient with a completeness of focus that was qualitatively different from what he saw from most of the nursing staff. It wasn't just competence. It was the particular kind of presence that came from having operated in conditions where the margin between a right decision and a wrong one was measured in seconds and outcomes that couldn't be reversed. He didn't know what he was seeing, but some part of him, underneath the performance of his own authority, understood that he was seeing something. Across the gurney, the younger Navy medic, late 20s, a scar running across the back of his left hand, had not looked away from Sarah since the moment she had stepped forward. He watched her the way someone watches a thing they weren't sure they'd ever see again. He looked at the officer. The officer gave him a single controlled headshake, almost imperceptible. Not here, not yet. The medic looked back at Sarah, and then, in a voice low enough that only the people immediately beside him could have caught it, he said a name, not Langford, not the name printed on the badge clipped to her scrubs. A different name, shorter, specific in the way call signs and operational designations are specific, carrying the compressed weight of a context that had nothing to do with Kellerman Regional Medical Center or Harwick Falls or anything in the professional history she had presented when she applied for this job. Sarah's hands paused above the monitoring equipment for exactly 1 second. 1 second. Then she resumed. But the officer had caught it. He had heard the name and the pause, and he was looking at her now with the open, unguarded expression of a man who had spent a long time being professionally certain of something and had just received confirmation he hadn't been sure he would ever get. Voss, standing at the edge of the bay, saw none of it. He was still trying to calculate how to recover authority over a room that had stopped consulting him entirely. The name hung in the air of the trauma bay for less than 2 seconds before the ambient noise of monitors and equipment absorbed it. But 2 seconds was enough. Sarah didn't look up from the monitoring leads she was adjusting. Her hands continued moving with the same steady efficiency they'd maintained throughout the procedure, checking the adhesion on the electrode pads, verifying the readout on the portable unit, making a notation in the chart that she would finish at the station afterward. Nothing in her posture changed. Nothing in the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head, the pace of her breathing indicated that anything unusual had just occurred. But the officer had gone very still. Commander Dax Rourke had spent 19 years in naval special operations. the last 7 in roles that required him to hold certain categories of information with the kind of care that most people reserved for things that could get them killed. Because in his experience, the two were not always separate categories. He was 51 years old, built lean in the way of men who had never stopped training, with gray coming in at his temples and a face that had been rearranged once by a training accident and twice by circumstances that didn't appear in any document he was authorized to discuss. He had learned to read rooms the way other people read text quickly, involuntarily, extracting meaning from the things that weren't being said as much as the things that were. He read this one in about 4 seconds. The medic, Petty Officer Garrett Solis, had spoken before he'd been able to stop himself. The recognition too immediate, too visceral, fully contained. Solis was 28 and had been running with the team for 3 years. He was good. He would get better if he learned to control the gap between recognition and response, and Rourke made a note to have that conversation with him later, in a context that had nothing to do with this hospital or this room. Right now, Rourke was looking at Sarah Langford, a name he had not known until 40 minutes ago, when the hospital liaison had faxed over the attending staff list for the receiving trauma unit. He had looked at it in the vehicle because he looked at all incoming information, and the name had not registered anything, which meant she had built a paper trail clean enough that a surface level check produced nothing interesting, which was itself interesting. He waited until the patient was fully stabilized and the room had moved into the lower register activity of post-intervention monitoring before he stepped to the edge of the bay and positioned himself where he could speak to her without involving the rest of the staff. She was completing her chart notation, standing at the rolling station just outside the bay entrance, her babashin fortubim entrance, her back partially to the room. He stopped 2 feet from her. She didn't look up. "You've been here 2 years, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes. Kellerman Regional. Harwick Falls. He said both as if he were reading from a file he was memorizing in real time. Yes. She finished the notation, capped her pen, and looked at him. Direct. Unhurried. Is your operator stable? Because that's what I need to be tracking right now. Stable. Dr. Ashburn has him. Rourke held her gaze. You caught a contracoup pneumothorax from a compressed field scan, taken at a training site, in under 10 seconds. It was closer to 3. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. I know. She didn't respond to that. She pulled the chart toward her and continued writing, and he let the silence sit for a moment, because he'd learned that certain people told you more through what they didn't fill than through anything they actually said. Solis shouldn't have said that, he said finally. No, she agreed. He recognized you. I heard him. Rourke studied her profile, the composed line of her jaw, the way her eyes moved across the chart with the particular focus of someone who had been trained to process information accurately under conditions significantly less comfortable than this one. She looked like a hospital nurse. She was wearing the clothes and the badge and the expression of a hospital nurse. But the way she had moved in that trauma bay, the angle of her approach to the patient, the speed with which she had read the scan, specific words she had used in the decompression procedure that weren't in any standard nursing protocol he'd ever reviewed, told a different story entirely. How long? He asked. She knew what he was asking. 2 years here. Before that, she stopped, looked at him steadily. Before that is before that. I need to know if you're minus... I'm a nurse, she said. Flat. Certain. At Kellerman Regional Medical Center in Harwick Falls, Pennsylvania. That's what I am today, and that's what I'll be tomorrow. Whatever you think you recognized in that room, she paused. Handle it quietly, Commander. He held her gaze for a long moment. There'll be a debrief, he said. Standard after an incident like this. I'll need your name on the witness list for the injury documentation. That's fine. I'll keep the rest of it separate. I'd appreciate that, she said. He nodded once, the specific acknowledgement of someone who understood that he was being asked to close a door and who was choosing, for now, to close it. Then he walked back into the trauma bay, without looking back, and Sarah returned to her chart as if the conversation had been about nothing more consequential than paperwork. Across the bay, Harlan Voss was watching. He hadn't heard the exchange, he was too far away, and both Rourke and Sarah had spoken at a register that didn't carry. He had watched the body language of it, the way the Navy commander had positioned himself specifically near her, the duration of the conversation, the quality of attention Rourke had given her. That was different, clearly. Obviously, different from the attention a senior officer typically extended to a hospital nurse during a post-intervention debrief. Voss didn't know what it meant. He knew that he didn't like it. The transport team stayed at Kellerman for another 90 minutes, while the patient underwent imaging, and the liaison officer completed the administrative documentation required when military personnel received civilian hospital care. During that time, Voss found 2 reasons to be on the 3rd floor that were both technically legitimate and entirely unnecessary: reviewing a chart that his resident could have reviewed, consulting briefly with a cardiologist colleague about a case that wasn't urgent. Both times he walked past the nursing station, where Sarah was working. Both times she didn't look up. By 6:15, the transport team had cleared out. Rourke had shaken hands with Ashburn and thanked her department formally. Solis had not spoken again, had kept his eyes forward, and his expression locked down, kleines overcorrected neutrality of someone managing a mistake he hadn't fully processed yet. The 3rd floor moved into evening rhythm. Sarah completed her shift at 7, filed her end-of-day notes, and left through the staff exit on the north side of the building the same way she always did, without announcement, without lingering, without the social decompression rituals that most of her colleagues performed at the end of a shift that had been, by any objective measure, significantly more complicated than usual. In the parking garage, she sat in her car for 4 minutes before starting the engine. She didn't call anyone, didn't text. Just sat with the engine off and the garage quiet around her, looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone conducting an internal inventory that they needed to finish before they could move. Then she started the car and drove home. The next morning arrived with the particular clarity of early October in western Pennsylvania, cold, bright. The kind of air that made the city look more defined than it actually was. Sarah arrived at Kellerman at 6:45, 30 minutes before her shift started, which was a habit she'd developed in her first month and had never broken. The nursing station on the 3rd floor had a different texture than usual. It wasn't immediately obvious. The same people at the same positions doing the same handoff procedures, but something a quality of attention that wasn't quite avoidance and wasn't quite confrontation, a collective awareness that had recalibrated overnight. She found out why when Priya caught her before she reached the locker room. HR sent a notice to the floor this morning, Priya said, her voice low. Formal investigation into the cafeteria incident. They're collecting witness statements. Sarah nodded. When? Today. They want people in by noon, if possible. Okay. Priya hesitated. There's something else. She glanced down the corridor. Voss got to Merritt last night, after hours. I don't know everything that was said, but this morning, Merritt circulated an internal memo characterizing the cafeteria incident as a bilateral conflict requiring HR review of both parties. Sarah looked at her. Both parties, she repeated. That's the language. Priya's expression had the quality of someone delivering news they found personally offensive. They're treating it as a mutual dispute. Sarah let that land. Let it sit in the space between them without reacting to it. Then she said, who gave witness statements to HR? Darlene already called in. 3 of the residents who were in the cafeteria said they'd cooperate. Marcus submitted a written account this morning. Priya paused. Voss told 2 of the senior attendings that you provoked him and that the investigation is politically motivated by nursing staff who have a history of targeting strong leadership. Strong leadership, Sarah said. Direct quote, apparently. She looked down the corridor. The morning light was flat and white through the window at the far end, the kind of light that flattened everything and made the hallway look longer than it was. What about the cafeteria footage? HR has it. Whether they've reviewed it yet, Priya shrugged carefully. I don't know. Sarah nodded slowly. Then she went to her locker, changed, and started her shift. The morning ran hard. 2 new admissions from overnight, a patient in 306 who had developed a post-op infection that needed intervention faster than the original monitoring schedule anticipated, and a transfer from the ICU that arrived with incomplete chart documentation and required Sarah to spend 40 minutes reconstructing the medication history before she could safely hand off to the incoming physician. She did all of it without complaint and without slowing down, which was the only way she knew how to do it. At 10:30, Voss appeared on the floor. He was not scheduled in the trauma unit that morning. His surgical slate was in the OR until noon, and there was no clinical reason for him to be on the 3rd floor. He came in through the north corridor. He spoke briefly with the charge nurse in a tone designed to sound casual, and then moved toward the nursing station, where Sarah was working through a stack of medication reconciliation forms. He stopped on the opposite side of the station counter. I heard HR is moving quickly, he said. She didn't look up. That's what I heard too. I want you to understand something. His voice had dropped to the register he used when he wanted to have a conversation that was ostensibly private, but conducted in a space where it could be overheard. What happened yesterday, the transport, the intervention, the way you positioned yourself in that situation, I'm going to address that separately. Nurses don't direct attending physicians in active trauma care. The fact that the outcome was positive doesn't change the protocol issue. She looked up then. His face was composed, confident, the expression of a man who had decided, in the 12 hours since a Navy commander had stood in his trauma bay and treated a nurse with more evident respect than he had ever shown her, that the appropriate response was to reassert the hierarchy more explicitly and more formally than he had before. You want to file a protocol complaint, she said. I want to document it appropriately. You want to file a complaint about a nurse who correctly identified a tension pneumothorax and assisted in an emergency intervention that improved the patient's outcome. I want to document the procedural irregularity of nursing staff overriding attending physician judgment in an active trauma bay. You weren't treating him, she said. You reached for his dressing without gloves and without authorization. I stopped an unsterile contact with an open decompression site. She set down her pen. If you file a protocol complaint about that, I'll file one about the sterile field violation. Those are facts. They're documented in Ashburn's notes and in mine. His jaw tightened slightly. You're escalating this. I'm describing what happened. The brief silence between them had a different quality than their previous ones. Less the silence of her absorbing contempt, and more the silence of 2 people who had just confirmed that they were in an actual conflict, not a managed imbalance of power. Voss straightened. You should consider your position here carefully, Ms. Langford. You've been at this institution for 2 years. I've been here for 11. I have relationships and a record that speaks for itself. You have, he gestured vaguely, whatever yesterday was. He walked away. She watched him go. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a 3-sentence note in her personal log with the date, time, and exact content of what he had just said, including the phrase whatever yesterday was, which she circled. The HR interviews ran through the afternoon. Sarah was called in at 2 o'clock, seated across from a woman named Pamela Greer, HR director, mid-50s, the kind of professional neutrality that had been built over a long career of sitting between institutional conflict and institutional liability. Greer had the cafeteria footage queued on her laptop. She had Darlene's photographs. She had 5 witness statements. She also, Sarah noticed, had a printed copy of the bilateral conflict memo that Merritt had circulated that morning, not prominently displayed, but visible in the corner of her desk in the way that documents are sometimes left visible when someone wants you to know they've seen them. The interview was recorded. Greer walked through the morning of the incident chronologically. Sarah answered every question with the specific accuracy of someone who had learned, in contexts with much higher stakes than a hospital HR interview, the difference between a statement that was defensible and one that was merely satisfying. At the end, Greer looked at her across the desk with an expression that had shifted slightly from the careful neutrality she'd maintained throughout. Is there anything else you want to add to the record? Yes, Sarah said. I've filed 3 formal concerns about Dr. Voss's conduct with this department over the past 8 months. I'd like to know whether those are part of this investigation's scope or whether they're being treated as separate matters. Greer looked at her folder. They've been noted. I'd like them included, Sarah said. The incident in the cafeteria wasn't isolated. It was the most visible instance of a pattern. If the investigation is limited to Tuesday morning, it won't produce an accurate picture. Greer made a note. I'll bring that to the review committee. Thank you, Sarah said. She stood, shook Greer's hand, and left. In the corridor outside the HR suite, she passed Dr. Remy Ashburn, Claire's husband, a hospitalist on the internal medicine floor who sheen too slightly from overlapping consults. He gave her a look that was a fraction longer than a passing colleague's look usually was. Claire told me about yesterday, he said. The intervention. It was a team effort, Sarah said. He nodded. She also said the Navy commander spent about 15 minutes talking to you specifically. After. Sarah met his eyes. Standard witness documentation. Remy Ashburn was not a stupid man. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone deciding whether the version of a story they'd been given was the complete one. Then he smiled, briefly, and said, of course, and kept walking. By 4 o'clock, the shape of what was happening in the institution had begun to clarify. Voss had spoken to 3 senior attendings, a department co-chair, and 2 members of the hospital's credentialing committee, not formally, not in documented meetings, but in the informal architecture of relationships built over 11 years that an institution like Kellerman ran on as much as it ran on policy. He wasn't making explicit requests. He was doing something more effective. He was establishing a narrative frame before the formal investigation could establish one. He was the experienced, accomplished physician dealing with an HR process that was being driven by nursing staff dissatisfied with the appropriate exercise of medical authority. He was the victim of institutional politics, not the subject of a legitimate complaint. It was working with some of them. Sarah could read it in the floor's social temperature, not hostility, exactly, but a certain hedging among people who had previously been neutral, a slight retraction of the visible solidarity that had existed in the hours immediately after the cafeteria incident, when the image of a doctor pouring coffee over a nurse's head had been fresh enough to produce uncomplicated reactions. Institutions were not complicated in their first hours. They became complicated in their second days. Marcus caught her in the break room at 4:30, alone, during the brief gap between afternoon and evening rounds. 2 of the residents walked back their statements. He said, without preamble. She looked at him. Walked back how? They submitted amended versions. Said they were unclear on the sequence of events and couldn't reliably corroborate specific details. He sat down across from her. Voss had lunch with their supervising attending today. She absorbed it. What about Darlene's photographs? Those are already in the record. Can't be walked back. He paused. The footage is in too. Greer reviewed it this morning before the interviews. Did she? She had a 90-minute meeting with Merritt and 2 people from legal this afternoon. He met her eyes. I don't know what that means yet. Sarah turned her coffee cup in her hands. It means they know the footage is unambiguous, and they're figuring out how much of a problem that is. Marcus was quiet for a moment. He was 31, had been on the unit for 4 years, had a careful, observant quality about him that she'd appreciated from their first shift together. He wasn't impulsive. When he said things, he'd thought about them. You're not from nursing school, are you? He said. Came out flat, not accusatory. Just a statement, looking for a response. She looked at him. I mean, you trained as a nurse, clearly. Your clinical record is clean. But the way you move in a trauma bay, the way you read that field scan yesterday, the way you talk to people who are in crisis. He stopped. It's not what they teach in a 2-year program. I've been doing this for a long time, she said. That's not an answer. It's the one I've got, she said. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded once the acceptance of someone who understood that there were limits to what a person owed you in the break room of a hospital where they were both trying to do their jobs. Okay, he said. They sat in silence for a minute. Outside the break room window, the sky over Harwick Falls had gone the flat gray of late afternoon, the kind of sky that made the city look like a photograph of itself. Voss isn't going to let this go through HR cleanly, Marcus said. I know. He has more to protect than you do. A complaint that sticks, falsification findings, harassment findings, that's his privileges, his record, his position. He looked at her. People protect those things hard. I know that too, she said. She stood, rinsed her cup at the sink, and went back to the floor. The call came at 6:58, 11 minutes before the end of her shift. It came through the main desk line, not the emergency intake, not the patient call system, but the external line that occasionally rang with interdepartmental transfers or physician consults. Everett took it, spoke for 30 seconds, then held the handset away from his ear and looked across the station toward Sarah with an expression she couldn't immediately read. For you, he said. External line. She crossed to the desk and took the handset. Langford. The voice on the other end was Rourke's. I'm going to keep this short, he said. The Navy has a formal interest in the documentation of yesterday's intervention. Psychsec tup tomorrow Mizai will be sending a liaison to the hospital tomorrow morning to collect the relevant records and speak with the attending staff. That's standard, she said carefully. There's something additional. He paused. The pause of someone choosing language with precision. I made some inquiries this afternoon. Not about you specifically, about the institution, the complaint history. Another pause. I'm told the situation with your colleague is more extensive than what's visible in yesterday's incident. She said nothing. When the liaison comes tomorrow, I'll have them prioritize the documentation of the intervention. But they'll also be conducting a broader review of the treatment of military personnel during their care period, which will require them to review staff conduct records for the receiving unit. His voice was even, neutral, entirely professional. For the period of the past 18 months, Sarah understood exactly what he was doing. 18 months of staff conduct records covered the entirety of Voss's documented interactions with nursing staff during the period she had been filing complaints. Complaints that had gone unanswered. Complaints that were now going to be reviewed not by an HR office trying to manage institutional liability, but by a formal military liaison with an independent mandate. That sounds thorough, she said. We take the care of our people seriously, Rourke said. Even after the fact. After the fact. She heard what he meant in those 3 words, not just the intervention yesterday, but everything before it. The record of what had been done to her and what had not been done about it. Thank you, Commander, she said. Langford. He stopped. For a moment, in the pause before he spoke again, something shifted in the register of his voice. Something that was not Commander Dax Rourke of Naval Special Operations, but something older and more direct than that. You caught it in 3 seconds. I clocked it. She didn't respond immediately. Care of yourself, he said, and disconnected. She held the handset for a moment before replacing it. Everett was looking at her. Everything okay? He said. The Navy is sending a liaison tomorrow, she said. They'll need access to the intervention documentation and staff conduct records for the unit. Can you flag that for Merritt's office tonight so it's not a surprise in the morning? Everett blinked. Sure. Yeah. He picked up a pen. Military liaison, intervention docs, conduct records. 18 months? 18 months, she said. She picked up her bag, completed her final notations, and clocked out at 7:03, 2 minutes late, which was rare for her and which nobody commented on. In the parking garage, she drove home in the early dark of October with the heater running and the radio off, thinking about 18 months of paperwork that was about to be read by people who had no interest in protecting the institution that had generated it. She was almost to her apartment when her phone buzzed on the passenger seat. She glanced at it at a red light. A text, unknown number, 4 words. Pulled the footage. She stared at it for a second. Then the light changed, and she drove, and the night settled around the city of Harwick Falls with the particular weight of something that had been building for a very long time and had just quietly and irrevocably begun to move. She didn't know who had sent the message, but she knew exactly what it meant. And in the morning, when the Navy liaison walked through the front doors of Kellerman Regional and requested 18 months of staff conduct documentation, Harlan Voss was going to find out that the woman he had poured coffee over in a crowded cafeteria had never, not once in 7 months, been as unprotected as he had assumed. She slept 4 hours. Not because she couldn't sleep longer. She had trained herself over years in environments where rest was rationed and deprivation was operational, but because her mind kept returning to the text message with the particular repetitive quality of something that hadn't been fully processed. They pulled the footage. 4 words that could mean the investigation was moving in her direction, or could mean someone was trying to get ahead of it. She didn't know which. She didn't know who had sent it, and the number had returned nothing when she tried to look it up, which told her the phone was either disposable or routed through something that made tracing it irrelevant. She got up at 4:30, made coffee, and sat at her kitchen table with the window open, despite the cold, listening to the city move through its early hours. She was not afraid. She had spent time in circumstances that redefined fear into something more specific and more actionable than what she was feeling now. And by comparison, this a hospital HR investigation, an institutional power structure being challenged by its own paper trail, was navigable. What she felt instead was something closer to the heightened, precise attentiveness of a person who understood that a situation had entered a phase where small decisions had outsized consequences and carelessness was no longer an available option. She arrived at Kellerman at 6:15. The building was still in its night configuration minimal corridor lighting. On the upper floors, overnight skeleton staff finishing their last hours, the particular institutional quiet that the day shift would dissolve within 40 minutes. She went to her locker, changed, and walked the floor before the handoff. Room 306's infection had responded to the antibiotic adjustment she'd flagged the day before. The post-op patient in 311 had a blood pressure reading that was lower than his overnight trend, suggested it tight should be, and she noted it in the chart with a recommendation for a physician review before 9. Room 308 was a new admission from the night elderly woman. Fall-related hip fracture, confused on intake, the kind of patient who required a particular quality of attention because their distress didn't always look like distress and their pain didn't always produce the sounds that triggered response. She spent 11 minutes with the woman in 308, sat beside the bed, spoke quietly, reoriented her to where she was and why, did not rush it. The day shift arrived at 7. Handoff completed. The floor found its rhythm. At 8:07, the Navy liaison walked through the front entrance of Kellerman Regional Medical Center. His name was Lieutenant Commander Brennan Polk, and he arrived with 2 things: a formal Navy document request bearing the correct authorizing signatures, and the specific unhurried confidence of someone who understood that institutions complied with federal military liaison requests, not because they were legally obligated to in every specific particular, but because the alternative was a conversation with people further up the chain who had considerably less patience for administrative hedging. He was 44, medium build, with the kind of face that was easy to underestimate, until you watched him read a room for 30 seconds and realized he'd cataloged everything in it, presented his credentials to the front desk, was directed to administration, and was in Merritt's office by 8:20. Sarah heard about it from Marcus at 8:45, who had heard it from the charge nurse on the administrative floor, who had watched Merritt's face change when Polk set the document request on his desk and waited. Merritt called legal immediately, Marcus said, his voice low at the medication station. Polk waited in the chair while Merritt had a 15-minute phone call with the hospital's counsel. Then legal called back and said, "Cooperate fully." What's he requesting? The intervention documentation from Tuesday Ashburn's notes, the imaging, the transport team's handoff record, and he paused. Staff conduct records for the third-floor trauma unit. 18 months. I know, she said. Marcus looked at her. I mean, that's what Everett flagged last night, she said. He studied her for a moment in the way he had yesterday in the break room, the careful, non-accusatory assessment of someone recalibrating their understanding of a person they thought they'd figured out. Then he went back to what he was doing. At 9:15, Voss arrived on the floor. He had been in the OR since 7, a scheduled procedure that had run slightly long, and he came through the north corridor, still in surgical scrub sweats, with his mask pulled down, moving with the compressed energy of someone who had just received information mid-procedure and had been processing it for the last 40 minutes without being able to respond to it. He went directly to the nurse's station. "Where is the Navy liaison?" he said. Everett looked up. "He's with Dr. Merritt, last I heard." Voss's jaw was tight. "What exactly is he requesting?" "I don't have the specifics." "Get me Merritt," Voss said. "Dr. Merritt's line has been, get him on the phone or tell me where he is." Everett picked up the handset with the deliberate patience of a man who had been handling difficult physicians for long enough to not be rattled by them. He dialed. He waited. He relayed in the same even voice, "Doctor. Merritt is in a meeting and will return calls after 10. Voss stood at the counter for 3 seconds. Then he turned and looked directly at Sarah, who was 6 feet away at the chart station, who was standing 6 feet away at the chart station, completing her 9 o'clock medication round documentation. She was looking at him, not in challenge, not with the edged defiance of someone who had just watched their opponent's position shift and wanted to mark the moment, just looking at him with the same steady, clear, completely unperturbed expression she'd had since the morning in the cafeteria, the expression that had driven him to pour coffee on her in the first place because it refused to confirm the version of herself he needed her to be. "This is your doing," he said. "Dr. Voss," she said, "I'm going to document that statement. Document whatever you want. I intend to." She turned back to the chart. He left the floor. At 10:40, Polk requested to speak with Sarah directly. He had been working through the administrative records for 2 hours, by that point, a process that was, by the account of the administrative assistant who had been assigned to assist him, extremely thorough and entirely without small talk. He reviewed documents with the focused neutrality of someone who had been doing this long enough to not telegraph his reactions to what he was reading. The request came through Merritt's office, which routed it to the charge nurse, which resulted in Everett appearing at the station with a slightly unusual expression. "The Navy liaison wants a statement from you about Tuesday's intervention," he said. "Voluntary. You can decline." "I won't decline," she said. She was brought to a conference room on the second floor, one of the smaller ones, used primarily one of the Parmitinti, with a white for departmental budget meetings, with a whiteboard on one wall and a window that looked on to the hospital's east parking lot. Polk was already there, a legal pad on the table, his document case closed beside him. He didn't offer pleasantries. She didn't need them. "I'm going to walk through the intervention sequence," he said. "I need your clinical account from the point of patient intake to the completion of the decompression procedure. Accurate, specific, in the order it happened." "Okay," she said. She gave it to him. 12 minutes, uninterrupted, covering the intake summary, her assessment of the portable scan, the specific indicators that led her to identify the secondary pneumothorax, the decompression procedure, and the patient's response. She used clinical terminology without over-explaining it and gave him the timeline with the precision of someone who had filed operational reports in environments where inaccuracy had consequences. When she finished, he made 3 additional notes on the pad and looked up. "Commander Rourke has indicated that your assessment of the contre-coup presentation was both rapid and accurate," he said. "It was accurate," she said. "I can't speak to how rapid it looked from the outside." He clocked it at approximately 3 seconds from initial scan review to verbal identification. "That sounds right." Polk looked at his pad. I need to ask you something outside the scope of the intervention documentation. He paused, framing it. In the conduct records I've reviewed this morning, your name appears in 3 filed complaints over an 8-month period, all directed at the same physician. None of them generated formal action. That's correct. Complaints describe a pattern of professional dismissal, interference with patient care communication, and what one notation characterized as deliberate undermining of nursing staff credibility in front of patients. He looked at her. Is that an accurate characterization? Yes. The cafeteria incident on Tuesday is documented with photographic evidence and cafeteria surveillance footage, he continued. The footage has been reviewed by this office. It shows the attending physician you named in the complaints deliberately pouring a liquid over you without physical provocation. She didn't respond. Following that incident, you returned to your unit and, several hours later, performed a clinical intervention that arguably preserved the readiness of a naval operator. He set the pen down. I want to be clear about what my office's interest is here. We are not conducting an HR investigation on behalf of this hospital. Our mandate is specific, document the care received by naval personnel, and ensure that the institutional environment in which that care was delivered meets the standard we expect when our people are in civilian medical facilities. I understand, she said. What I am also noting, for the record, is that the conduct documented in those 3 complaints, the pattern of interference, the public dismissal. The Tuesday incident represents an institutional failure. This hospital received a complaint 8 months ago that described interference with patient care communication. That complaint was not acted on. He picked up his pen again. That is now part of my report. Sarah held his gaze. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, Polk said. This is documentation. What the institution does with it is their process. He looked back at his pad. But institutions respond differently to documented findings from an external federal review than they do to internal HR reports, in my experience. She understood what he was telling her. He was not promising her anything. He was too careful for that, and she was too experienced to want a promise she hadn't asked for. But he was telling her that the document he was building had a different weight than anything the hospital's own HR process had produced. They finished the session 20 minutes later. She shook his hand at the door. He returned to his review without further ceremony. The rest of the morning moved with the deceptive normalcy of a floor that was doing its regular work while something larger built around it. Patients needed care. Medications needed administering. A new admission came in at 11 from the ER, a 47-year-old man with a suspected pulmonary embolism who needed immediate assessment and anticoagulation management while the imaging team prepared. Sarah managed him with 2 other nurses and the on-duty physician, Dr. Yolanda Ferris, and the case required the kind of focused intensity that temporarily cleared everything else from the available mental space. The patient was scared, which expressed itself in his case as aggression. He argued about the IV placement, challenged every instruction, demanded to know why he wasn't being seen by a surgeon. Sarah handled him steadily, not by performing patients, which people in that state could always detect as false, but by meeting him where his fear actually lived. You're scared, she said, not gently, just directly. He stopped arguing. That's reasonable. You came in not knowing what was happening to your body, and now there are people around you doing things you don't fully understand. Scared too. She held the IV line steady. I need about 90 seconds of cooperation. Can you give me that? He gave her 2 minutes. Ferris caught her eye across the bed with an expression that had nothing to do with the patient. The embolism was confirmed on imaging. The patient was transferred to a higher level of care within the hour. Outcome, appropriate. Sarah was back at the medication station by 12:15, eating half a granola bar she'd pulled from her bag because she'd skipped her actual break when the floor's ambient atmosphere changed. She felt it before she identified it, the specific shift in sound and movement that a contained space makes when something significant has entered it. Voices dropping at the nursing station. the charge nurse moving more deliberately. 2 of the day, nurses angling their heads toward the south corridor in the way people do when something is coming that they want to observe without appearing to observe. She looked up. Voss was coming down the south corridor, and he was not alone. Behind him, Merritt, with the taut, controlled expression of a man who was managing something he hadn't chosen. And behind Merritt, 2 people Sarah hadn't seen before, a woman in a tailored gray suit who moved with the practiced composure of hospital legal counsel, and a man in administrative attire whose badge identified him as belonging to the executive floor. The configuration told her something. Merritt flanking Voss rather than leading meant this had not been Merritt's idea. Legal present meant whatever was happening had been escalated to a level where documentation of every word and action was now the institution's primary concern. The executive presence meant this had cleared his level and involved the kind of decision-making that senior leadership was responsible for. Voss saw her at the medication station and came directly toward her. She put down the granola bar. Ms. Langford. His voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. She could hear the compression in it, the effort of a man who was furious and could not afford to be. I want to discuss the conduct of your interactions with the Navy liaison this morning. That was a formal documented interview, she said. I don't think this is the appropriate setting to discuss it. Provided information to an external reviewer without going through proper. The interview was requested by Lieutenant Commander Polk through official channels, WECT. I was asked to participate voluntarily. I did. She looked at Merritt. Was that procedurally improper? Merritt's expression was the expression of a man walking a tightrope in a windstorm. No, he said. It wasn't. Voss turned to him sharply. Merritt didn't move. The woman in the gray suit Sarah had placed her now. As Jana Whitfield, one of the hospital's 2 in-house counsels, took a small step forward. Dr. Voss, perhaps we should take this conversation. What exactly did you tell them? Voss said. He was looking at Sarah. The control in his voice had frayed slightly at the edge. Not into shouting, but into the kind of intensity that was almost worse, the specific pitch of a man who had decided that decorum was now less important than finding out how much damage had been done. I gave an accurate clinical account of Tuesday's intervention, Sarah said, and the complaints. Lieutenant Commander Polk asked me to confirm the accuracy of information contained in documentation. He was already reviewing, she said. I confirmed it. Voss's face changed, not dramatically. This wasn't a man who expressed himself dramatically. But something shifted behind his eyes, a rapid internal calculation running through its options and coming up shorter than he'd expected. The administrative man behind Merritt, his badge, said T. Calloway, VP Operations, cleared his throat. Dr. Voss, I think we need to continue this in a more appropriate setting. She went around the internal review process, Voss said, to Calloway, to Merritt, to the room in general. Lieutenant Commander Polk requested information within his official mandate, Calloway said. His voice had the careful flatness of executive HR language, every syllable chosen for its defensibility. We are legally required to cooperate with federal liaison requests. Ms. Langford's participation in that process was appropriate. The floor had gone almost entirely quiet. Pretense of not watching had been abandoned. People were watching, because what was happening in the corridor outside the medication station was too visible and too significant for the normal performance of inattention. Voss understood that. He looked at Sarah. And then he did the thing that she would later think had been his final, definitive miscalculation, not because it was irrational, but because it was entirely consistent with who he was, and who he was had never been adequately challenged before this moment. Stepped forward. Not far. 18 inches, maybe, but the step had a specific character to it, the movement of a man who had always operated from the assumption that physical size and positional authority were interchangeable currencies, that moving toward someone who worked for him was a way of re-establishing the natural order of things. His hand came up and closed around her upper arm. Not a grab, exactly. More like the gesture of someone who was used to directing other people's movement with physical contact and had never been told they couldn't. What happened in the next 4 seconds happened so fast that most of the people watching would later struggle to sequence it accurately. Sarah's left hand came up and made contact with the inside of his wrist, not a strike, a redirect, the precise application of counterforce at the joint that broke his grip before it fully formed. Her right hand moved simultaneously, catching his redirected momentum and using it, and then Harlan Voss, 60 pounds heavier than her, 11 years her senior, cardiothoracic surgeon with a procedure record that hospital administrators cited in funding presentations, was on the floor. Not violently, not brutally. She had taken him down with the controlled, efficient economy of someone who had been trained to neutralize a physical threat with the minimum force required, and she'd done it so cleanly that the transition from standing to floor had been almost seamless, as if gravity had simply made a decision without consulting him. Step back immediately, hands open, away from her body. She did not continue. She did not move toward him. She simply stood there, the same expression on her face she'd had since Tuesday morning in the cafeteria, steady and clear and entirely unrattled. The corridor was absolutely silent. Voss looked up from the floor with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, not anger, not calculation, not the confident contempt that had characterized every interaction they'd had for 7 months. Something rawer than that. The exposed, unguarded look of a man who had just encountered a reality he had no framework for processing. Jonna Whitfield had both hands pressed flat against the wall behind her. Calloway had gone completely still. Merritt was looking at Sarah with an expression that contained, in its center, something that might, in a different person, in a different moment, have been shame. "Put his hands on me," Sarah said. Her voice was level, completely level. "That is documented as of right now." Nobody spoke. "I need someone to call security," she said. "And I need someone to tell me whether we're going to handle this correctly, because I will not be walking away from this one quietly." Calloway moved first. He reached for his phone. Voss started to get up from the floor. "Don't," Whitfield said. Not to Sarah, to Voss. Her voice carried the specific, clipped authority of legal counsel who had just watched their institution's liability exposure double in under 5 seconds. "Dr. Voss, do not move until security arrives." He looked at her. "Do not move," she said again. He stayed on the floor. Security arrived in 3 minutes. 2 officers, professional, unhurried, the kind of response that came from people who had been doing this long enough to not escalate what was already elevated. They spoke with Calloway and Whitfield. They documented Voss's position, the corridor configuration, the witnesses present. They did not touch anyone. Voss was asked to accompany them to the security office, pending administrative review. He went. He didn't speak as he left, not to Merritt, not to the staff watching from the station, not to Sarah. He walked past her without looking at her. The floor stayed quiet for a long moment after he was gone. Then Priya, from her position near the nurse's station, exhaled a breath that was barely audible and said nothing. Merritt looked at Sarah. His face had gone through several configurations in the last 10 minutes, and it arrived left at something that was not comfortable for either of them. "You injured?" he said. "No." He nodded. He looked down at his hands briefly, like a man reviewing a set of decisions he'd made over the past 8 months, and finding the accounting unfavorable. "I owe you—" "Not right now," she said. "I need to finish my medication round." He blinked. "Yes, of course." She turned back to the medication station, picked up her granola bar, set it back down because she was no longer hungry, pulled the medication cart toward room 303, and began the second half of what had already been a very long morning. By 2 o'clock, what had happened in the corridor was everywhere. Not just the 3rd floor, the hospital's informal network moved these things with a speed that no administrative communication could match, and by early afternoon, the corridor incident had moved through the ER, the surgical suites, the administrative floor, and the cafeteria, picking up additional details with each retelling, some accurate and some extrapolated. But the core of it, Voss had grabbed her arm. She'd put him on the floor. Security had been called. Voss had left the building was consistent across versions, because it had been witnessed by enough people with enough credibility that the embellishment couldn't alter the structure. What also spread, because Darlene had texted 3 people and Marcus had said something to the hospitalist on the second floor, was a different kind of information, that the Navy liaison was still in the building reviewing records, that his presence was connected to the nurse from the 3rd floor trauma unit, that the intervention on Tuesday had apparently involved something more than standard nursing care, though the specifics of that were murkier and traveled with less confidence. At 2:30, Polk requested a second meeting. He was in the same conference room, same legal pad. But his expression had changed in a way that Sarah noticed and couldn't immediately characterize something that wasn't surprise, but was adjacent to it. The quality of a person who has been confirming information they expected to find and has instead found something they didn't. He slid a single sheet across the table. She looked at it. Printed copy of an incident report, securities documentation of the corridor altercation, generated within the last hour. I need to add this to my report, he said. I need your verbal confirmation of the sequence. She gave it. 45 seconds, he wrote. Then he set the pen down and folded his hands on the pad, and there was a quality to the silence that preceded what he said next, that she recognized the pause before someone says something they've been deciding whether to say. Commander Rourke is returning to Harwick Falls tomorrow, he said. She was careful. For the operator follow-up? Partially. Polk looked at her steadily. He's also been in contact with the hospital's executive director. Directly. Not through the liaison process directly. He paused. I don't know the content of that conversation. But I know that the executive director has scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning and that your name is on the agenda. She absorbed that. Her name, she said. Polk looked at her. Langford, she said. My name. Yes, he said. Your name is on the agenda. She looked at the incident report on the table between them. The documentation of Voss's hand on her arm. Her response. The corridor. The witnesses. The security officers. 8 months of complaints that had gone nowhere, compressed into 4 seconds in a hospital hallway, finally producing a paper trail that couldn't be recharacterized. What time is the board meeting? She said. 8 a.m. She nodded. She stood. She extended her hand, and Polk shook it. She was halfway to the door when his voice stopped her. Langford. He said it, the way Rourke had, not the way her colleagues said it, but with a slightly different weight, as if it was a name he'd found in a document that referenced a different name, and he was choosing to use this one out of professional courtesy. Stopped. Whatever's in your file from before, he said carefully. It's not part of my report. That's not my lane. She looked at him across the room. I appreciate that, she said. She left. In the corridor outside, she walked the length of the second floor to the stairwell at the north end, not because it was fastersy, but because she needed the distance, the unobserved 30-second of movement, to compress everything the afternoon had produced into something she could carry through the remaining 2 hours of her shift. She pushed through the stairwell door. Standing at the bottom of the first landing, looking up at her, was Commander Dax Rourke. He was in civilian clothes, a dark jacket, no insignia, and he looked like he'd been there for a few minutes, which meant he'd known she was coming down this stairwell, which meant someone had told him, which opened a set of questions she didn't have time to run through right now. She stopped on the top step. He looked up at her. You're early, she said. I drove, he said. Polk called me after the corridor incident. She said nothing. I need to tell you something, he said, and I need to tell it to you here, not in a conference room, not in front of counsel, not on a recorded line. Stairwell was concrete and institutional and smelled like floor cleaner. Somewhere below them, a door opened and closed. He waited for the footsteps to pass. Then he said, the board meeting tomorrow isn't just about Voss. She looked at him. There's a secondary component that Calloway initiated this afternoon, Rourke said. He's requesting a review of your credentials and employment history. He's framing it as a routine verification, triggered by the conduct incident. His eyes were steady. It isn't routine. Her chest did not move. Her breathing did not change. They're going to find something, he said. She held his gaze for a long time. I know, she said. And the way she said it, not with fear, not with resignation, but with the contained, weighted certainty of someone who had been waiting for this particular door to open for 2 years, told Rourke everything he needed to know about how much of what was coming she had already seen. Snan. The stairwell held the silence for 3 full seconds after she said it. Rourke was watching her with the particular attention of someone who had just received confirmation of a thing they had suspected and was now recalibrating the entirety of what that meant. He didn't push immediately. He'd learned over a long career of working with people who operated from concealment that the instinct to fill silence was something you trained out of yourself, that the most useful information came from the space after a significant statement, not from the question you rushed to ask before it finished landing. She came down 2 steps, sat on the 3rd from the bottom, which put her eye level, roughly, with him, where he stood on the landing. It was an odd configuration, slightly undignified, not what either of them would have chosen for this conversation. But the stairwell was what they had, and she had long since stopped requiring comfortable conditions for difficult things. What do they have? She said. Calloway ran a secondary background check through a private verification service this afternoon. Not the standard HR process, a different vendor, one that goes deeper into employment history gaps and credential chains. He kept his voice low, flat. The nursing license is clean. It's real. It's yours. But the employment history from the decade before your licensure has some, he paused, choosing the word, impression, meaning it's short, meaning it covers a period of about 10 years with 3 entries that don't hold up to direct verification because the institutions that would verify them are either classified, dissolved, or non-public. She looked at the concrete floor between her feet. They'll frame it as credential misrepresentation, she said. Not a question. Calloway's counsel will. Yes. He crossed his arms not defensively, just the posture of a man standing in a cold stairwell, thinking through a problem with multiple moving parts. The board meeting tomorrow is the vehicle. Credential irregularity triggers a mandatory review process. During review, your patient care access is suspended. Suspension pending review is the kind of thing that looks, from the outside, like a finding even when it isn't. And Voss's attorney contacted the hospital's legal team an hour ago. He's framing the corridor incident as a physical assault by a staff member with a potentially falsified employment history. 2 narratives support each other. Rourke said it without editorializing, because he was too experienced to editorialize about a competent tactical move, even when it came from someone he found contemptible. Clean play. If you can't defend the employment history in a public review setting, everything else gets contaminated by it. Sarah was quiet for a moment. How much time do I have? She said. Board meeting's at 8. It's 4:50 now. She did the arithmetic. Roughly 15 hours. Not long, and not short enough time to do something. Not enough time to do everything. What are you willing to put in the room tomorrow? She said. He looked at her directly. I'm a Navy commander with an active liaison mandate connected to this institution. My presence at a board meeting is legitimate. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of a person weighing something against a set of constraints that were real and that they couldn't simply override because they found them inconvenient. There are things I can speak to officially, he said. Tuesday's intervention, the conduct record as it relates to the care environment for naval personnel, the physical incident today. He paused. There are things I can't speak to officially because they're classified, because they don't exist in any document I'm authorized to reference in a civilian administrative proceeding. He met her eyes. What I can do is be in the room, and the people in that room will know who I am, and some of them will know enough to understand what it means that I'm there. It wasn't a promise. It wasn't a guarantee. It was the honest account of what the situation actually offered, which she respected more than a reassurance would have been. Stood up from the step. I need to make a phone call, she said. To? She looked at him steadily. To the person who sent me that text last night. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. You know who that was. I have a reasonable idea, she said. He nodded slowly. Don't do it from your cell. She almost smiled. No. She pushed through the stairwell door and walked back into the hospital. She finished her shift at 7. She documented everything that needed documenting, completed her end-of-day handoffs with the precision she always maintained, and did not allow the weight of what was coming to bleed into her patient care, not because she was performing normalcy, but because the patients in rooms 303 through 312 had no part in what was happening in the administrative structure of the institution around them and didn't deserve to absorb its consequences. The woman in 308, the hip fracture patient, confused on intake, had become more oriented over the course of the day. She recognized Sarah when she came in for the evening medication round, and she reached out and touched the back of her hand briefly, the gesture of a person who was grateful and didn't have the words for it. Sarah stayed 2 minutes longer than she needed to. She left at 7:08, drove to a gas station 4 blocks from her apartment, used the landline at the counter which still existed, improbably because the owner was 73 and didn't see a reason to remove it, and made a 7-minute call. She didn't say much during the call. She asked 2 specific questions and received 2 specific answers, and by the time she hung up, she had the shape of what she needed. She bought a bottle of water and drove home. At 5:40 the following morning, while the city was still gray and the hospital was running its overnight minimum, Harlan Voss arrived at Kellerman. He was not scheduled. He had been administratively suspended from patient care pending the security review of the corridor incident, which meant his access to clinical areas was restricted, but his physical access to the building was not yet revoked, a detail that, in most institutions, took longer to operationalize than the decision that produced it. His badge still worked. He came through the physician entrance on the south side of the building at 5:40, went to Breckley's office on the 2nd floor, and spent approximately 40 minutes there before anyone from administration was aware he was in the building. What he did in those 40 minutes would not become fully clear until later. 6:15, Calsaway's assistant arrived at the executive floor to prepare the board meeting materials and discovered that 3 files in the shared administrative document system had been accessed at 5:52 from a terminal in Voss's office. The files were from the HR complaint archive, specifically the 3 formal complaints Sarah had filed over the preceding 8 months. The assistant flagged it to Callaway at 6:20. Callaway, to his credit, called hospital security and legal simultaneously. Polk, who had stayed overnight in Harwick Falls and was already at the hospital by 6:30 to prepare his own materials for the board meeting, was informed by Whitfield at 6:45 that Voss had accessed HR complaint files outside his authorization during a period when he was under administrative suspension. Polk made a note. Then he made a call. By 7:15, when Sarah arrived at Kellerman in the same dark clothing she wore, on days when she wasn't starting with a shift, she had the 8 o'clock meeting and then a 10 o'clock start. Assuming she still had a job, the building had a different energy than it normally carried at that hour. The overnight staff finishing up had the specific alertness of people who had heard something and were waiting for it to resolve, and 2 security officers were visible in the main corridor in a way that was slightly more deliberate than routine positioning. Marcus was waiting near the front entrance. He'd texted her at 6:50, "Come in through the main doors. I'll be there." She'd read it and come in through the main doors. Voss was in the building this morning, Marcus said without preamble. Before 6, he accessed the HR complaint files. She absorbed it. He was trying to see what documentation existed, she said. That's what Whitfield thinks. Security pulled the access log. He fell into step beside her. Callaway is furious, not because he cares about protecting you, because Voss just handed the board a second misconduct incident, 12 hours before the meeting where they were planning to use credential review to neutralize you. She looked at him. "How do you know?" that's what they were planning. He met her gaze. Because I overheard Calloway on the phone yesterday at 4:30 in the corridor, outside the conference room, and I have been on this unit for 4 years, and I know how this building makes people disappear when they become inconvenient. He said it plainly, without drama. And I wasn't going to let that happen without at least making sure you knew it was coming. Stopped walking. He stopped beside her. That was you, she said. Text. He looked at her evenly. I don't know what text you're referring to. Corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Thank you, Marcus. Don't thank me. Just go to the meeting. She went to the meeting. The boardroom on the executive floor was a space designed to communicate the weight of decisions. Long table, leather chairs, a wall of windows looking onto the city, a specific aesthetic of institutional authority. 8 people were seated when she arrived at 7:58. 4 board members, Calloway, Whitfield, Merritt, and a woman she didn't recognize who turned out to be the hospital's executive director, Dr. Sandra Okafor, 58, Nigerian-American, the kind of presence that made a room realign itself without her having to ask. Rourke was seated along the wall, not at the table. Observer position, formal but separate. Polk was beside him. Voss was not present. That absence reconfigured everything before a word was spoken. Sarah took the chair she was directed to, across from Okafor, and set her hands flat on the table in front of her. She had brought one thing, a manila folder, closed, set beside her right hand. Okafor opened the meeting without ceremony. Ms. Langford, this review was initiated following a series of incidents, including an HR complaint process, a physical incident in a patient care corridor, and a credential verification inquiry. She spoke with the directness of someone who found procedural framing tedious but necessary. I want to be clear at the outset that this is not a disciplinary proceeding. It is a review. The distinction matters. I understand, Sarah said. I also want to note for the record that as of 6:50 this morning, the scope of this meeting has been modified. Okafor looked at Calloway briefly, a look that carried something between professional neutrality and personal displeasure. We will address the credential question. We will also address a secondary incident involving unauthorized file access that occurred within this building earlier this morning. Calloway's expression was carefully neutral. Whitfield opened her legal pad. Okafor turned back to Sarah. The credential verification identified gaps in your employment history prior to your nursing licensure, specifically a 10-year period with 3 employer entries that could not be directly verified through standard channels. Can you speak to that? Yes, Sarah said. She opened the manila folder. Inside was a single document, 2 pages, printed, bearing a header that was not a hospital letterhead or an HR form. She slid it across the table to Okafor. Okafor looked at it. Her expression shifted in a controlled but unmistakable way, the recalibration of someone who had walked into a room with one set of assumptions and encountered information that required a different framework. She passed it to Whitfield. Whitfield looked at it. Then she looked at Rourke, sitting along the wall. Rourke said nothing. He did not need to. This is a verification letter, Okafor said carefully, from the Naval Special Operations Medical Program. It confirms that the employment period in question reflects service in a classified medical support role, Sarah said. The specific details of that service remain classified, but the existence of the service and its relevance to the credential gap is confirmed in that letter. She kept her voice level. The letter was authorized for release in connection with Lieutenant Commander Polk's liaison investigation. Commander Rourke facilitated the authorization. The room was quiet. One of the board members, a man named Harwick, whom she recognized from the hospital's public-facing materials, as the board chair was looking at her with the specific expression of a person rapidly revising a narrative they had walked in, prepared to execute. You served in a classified Naval Special Operations medical role, he said. For a portion of the period in question, yes. And this couldn't be disclosed during your standard employment verification. Classified service doesn't appear in standard employment verification by design, she said. I disclosed what I was able to disclose. The gaps existed because the work I was doing during that period doesn't produce a publicly verifiable paper trail. Harwick looked at Rourke. Commander. Rourke spoke from his position along the wall. His voice was measured, official. The letter represents an accurate characterization. Miss Langford's service record, to the extent I'm authorized to address it, is consistent with the document she's provided. Clinical competency, as demonstrated in Tuesday's intervention with naval personnel, reflects training and experience that is not available through standard nursing programs. He paused. I will also note, for the board's awareness, that Lieutenant Commander Polk's investigation has produced findings regarding the institutional response to Ms. Langford's conduct complaints that will be included in our formal report to Naval Liaison Command. The silence that followed was the silence of a room, understanding that it was being observed, and that what it did next was going to be documented by people who had no institutional loyalty to Kellerman Regional Medical Center. Calloway shifted in his chair. Okafor looked at him. Just looked at him. Then she looked back at Sarah. I want to address the physical incident in the corridor yesterday, she said. Of course, Sarah said. Security documentation and 6 witness statements indicate that, Doctor. Voss made physical contact with you first. Okafor's language was precise and deliberate. Your response was immediate, controlled, and did not continue after the threat was neutralized. That's accurate. Dr. Voss's characterization of the incident as an unprovoked assault is contradicted by the security footage and by all 6 witness accounts. Okafor looked down at the documents in front of her. I've reviewed the footage myself this morning. One of the other board members, a woman named Tran, who had been silent until this point, leaned forward slightly. Ms. Langford, the response you demonstrated, the physical technique, is not standard nursing training. No, Sarah agreed. It isn't. Is it related to the service documented in that letter? Yes. Tran nodded slowly, as if that answered something she had been trying to place since the meeting began. The meeting ran 90 minutes. By the end of it, the credential question had been formally resolved. The naval verification letter entered into her permanent file as investigation closed, with a finding of no misrepresentation. The physical incident in the corridor had been formally characterized as defensive response to an unauthorized physical contact initiated by a suspended physician. And then Okafor, in the final 15 minutes, turned the meeting in a direction that Calloway had clearly not anticipated. She opened a second folder. In connection with Commander Rourke's liaison investigation, she said, we received this morning a compiled summary of the 3 formal complaints filed by Ms. Langford against Dr. Voss over the preceding 8 months, along with documentation of the institutional responses to those complaints. She looked at Merritt directly for the first time in the meeting. You received the 3rd complaint personally, in writing. 3 months ago, Merritt looked like a man who had known this moment was coming and had not found a way to prepare for it adequately. I did. And the documented response is an acknowledgement of receipt. Yes. No follow-up action. The pause before he answered was 1 second too long. There were discussions internally. That did not produce a documented outcome, Okafor said. Not harshly, just precisely. 3 months after receiving a written complaint describing repeated interference with patient care communication and systematic professional dismissal, the physician named in that complaint poured a liquid over the complainant's head in a room containing approximately 15 witnesses and a cafeteria surveillance camera. She closed the folder. I want the board to understand clearly that I view the institutional response to those complaints as a significant failure. And I want Ms. Langford to understand that this board takes that failure seriously. Sarah said nothing. She didn't need to. Harwick cleared his throat. What is the board's current posture on Dr. Voss? Whitfield answered before Okafor could. As of 6:50 this morning, Doctor. Voss's administrative suspension has been extended pending a full review of the unauthorized file access, the corridor incident, and an audit of his patient care records for the preceding 18 months that was initiated by Lieutenant Commander Polk's investigation. She glanced at her notes. His hospital credentials are suspended for the duration of the review. His attorney has been notified. What does the audit involve? Harwick said. Polk answered from the wall. Our investigation identified irregularities in the clinical documentation from Dr. Voss's patient care records, specifically notation discrepancies between original entries and subsequent amendments that are inconsistent with standard correction protocols. He kept his voice even. We've flagged those discrepancies to the Pennsylvania State Medical Board, who have initiated their own inquiry. Process is now separate from this institution's internal review. The room absorbed it. The State Medical Board, a separate process, a process that operated outside the hospital's ability to contain or manage it. Calloway had gone very still. Merritt was looking at the table. Sarah was looking at neither of them. She was looking at the window, the city of Harwick Falls, in the October morning light, flat and gray and ordinary, going about itself without any awareness of what was happening in this room. She thought about 8 months of complaints that went nowhere, about the cafeteria and the coffee and the expression on Voss's face when he said, "Know your place," about the residents who had amended their witness statements and the attendings who had hedged and the institutional had hedged and the institutional machinery that had spent 11 months treating her patients as proof that she had nothing to say. She didn't feel triumphant. That wasn't what this felt like from the inside. Felt like the specific, exhausted relief of someone who had been holding a position for a very long time under conditions that required them not to show how much it cost, and who could feel, for the first time, the weight beginning to distribute differently. The meeting ended at 9:40. Okafor asked Sarah to stay as the others filed out. Rourke and Polk remained as well, by arrangement that Sarah didn't ask about and didn't need to. When the room was down to 4 people, Okafor looked at Sarah across the table with an expression that had dropped the administrative register entirely. "You knew what was in that folder before you brought it," she said. "Yes." "You've had the verification letter for how long?" Sarah looked at her steadily. "I requested it the night before last." Commander Rourke facilitated the release. Okafor looked at Rourke quickly. "Ms. Langford's situation warranted expedience," he said. Okafor returned to Sarah. "You didn't bring it to the initial HR investigation." "The initial HR investigation was an internal process," Sarah said. "Bringing classified service documentation into an internal HR process without understanding how that institution would handle it, whether it would remain appropriately protected, wasn't something I was willing to do. This setting was different. This setting had federal observers with independent documentation mandates," Sarah said. "Yes, that's different." Okafor was quiet for a moment. She was, Sarah thought, genuinely trying to understand the architecture of what had happened, how a nurse on the 3rd floor had navigated a situation that most people in her position would have either fled or lost. She wasn't asking out of suspicion. She was asking out of something closer to professional respect for a level of strategic patience she hadn't expected. "What do you need from this institution going forward?" Okafor said. Question was direct enough that Sarah took a moment with it. "I need the 3 complaints formally expunged from any conduct framing and reclassified as accurate reports that weren't acted on," she said. "I need the credential file corrected with the verification letter. And I need to go back to work." "That's it?" "That's it." Okafor looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote 3 lines on the notepad in front of her and said, "I'll have Whitfield draft the formal record corrections today. You can return to your unit tomorrow pending paperwork." She paused. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry for what this institution failed to do when it should have done it. It was not a performance." Sarah could tell the difference. "Thank you," she said. She stood, shook Okafor's hand, nodded to Polk, and looked, last, at Rourke. He stood from his chair. "I'll walk you out," he said. In the corridor outside the boardroom, away from everyone, he stopped. "State Board inquiry," he said. "The documentation irregularities Polk flagged." She looked at him. "When Voss accessed the HR complaint files this morning, Rourke said carefully, 'What do you think he was looking for?' "He was checking what documentation existed before the board meeting," she said. trying to understand the scope of what was going to be in the room. Yes, Rourke said, but Polk's team pulled the file access log and ran a comparison against the complaint documents. He paused. 2 of those complaint documents had been amended, not significantly small alterations. Language that changed the characterization of 2 incidents from Voss initiated to bilateral. She went still. The amendments were time-stamped to 3 months ago, Rourke said. 2 weeks after the 3rd complaint was filed. 3 months ago, after she'd filed the complaint that went to Merritt. After the acknowledgement of receipt that produced no follow-up action. Someone altered the complaint documents in the HR system, she said. File access trail from this morning shows Voss's credentials, Rourke said. But the amendments from 3 months ago were made from a different terminal. He looked at her, an administrative terminal on the 2nd floor. The 2nd floor was where HR was located, and Merritt's office. The specific cold clarity of that landed in her chest and sat there, not shocked, because she had suspected something like it. But the confirmation thing she'd hoped was simpler than it turned out to be. Polk has it, she said. Polk has the access log, Rourke said. His team is running the terminal ID against the building's badge access records for that date. He let the sentence stop there. She understood what he wasn't saying. The inquiry was active. The documentation was in motion. And the finding when it came was going to answer a question that was significantly larger than whether Harlan Voss was a bad physician who had finally been held accountable. Someone had tampered with her complaints. Someone in this building with access to the administrative systems and sufficient confidence in the institution's protection of their position altered the formal record of what she had reported, had made her complaints look like something they weren't, had given Voss's narrative a textual foundation in the official documentation, turned the paper trail that should have protected her into part of the machinery that dismissed her. And that person had done it from an administrative terminal. On the 2nd floor, 2 weeks after Oliver Merritt received a complaint he had acknowledged and never acted on. Rourke watched her process it. He didn't rush her. When she looked at him again, her expression had not changed in any dramatic way. But there was something in her eyes, the compressed intensity of someone who had believed they understood the dimensions of the problem they were in, and had just discovered it was larger and older and went deeper into the institution than they had known. How long before Polk has the terminal identification? She said. He's running it now, Rourke said. His estimate was 2 hours. She looked at the corridor, at the boardroom door, still closed, the elevator bank at the far end, and the stairwell, and the ordinary institutional landscape of a hospital that had been doing something significantly less ordinary inside its administrative systems for the past 3 months. Then we wait, she said, and 2 hours later, when Polk knocked on the door of the small office, where Sarah and Rourke had been going through the formal timeline of the complaint amendments in preparation for whatever came next. His expression when he entered told her everything before he said a word. He set the terminal identification report on the table between them. She looked at it. The badge access record for the administrative terminal used to amend her complaint documents 3 months ago showed 1 entry, 1 badge, 1 person who had been in that office at that hour on that date and whose credentials had been used to make the changes that had partially buried what she had reported. It was not Merritt's badge. It was Voss's. Harlan Voss had had administrative access to the HR system access that, according to the system's permission architecture, he should not have had access that someone had granted him at some point in the preceding year through a process that was not logged in any standard administrative record. He had accessed the complaint files 3 months ago, altered the documentation of 2 incidents, and had come back this morning after the board meeting was announced, after the Naval Liaison investigation had begun pulling on threads he hadn't anticipated to look at what remained. He hadn't come this morning to understand what was in the room. He'd come to see how much of what he'd already done was still hidden. Polk looked at Sarah across the table. "The state board is going to want to talk to you," he said. "This morning's file access The amendments from 3 months ago, the documentation irregularities in his patient care, records it's a pattern. They'll need your full account as a named complainant whose reports were altered. She nodded. There's one more thing, Polk said. He turned to the next page of the report. Permission that gave Voss administrative HR system access was granted 11 months ago. The authorization came from a second-floor terminal. He paused. From an account registered to Dr. Oliver Merritt. The room was very quiet. 11 months ago. 1 month before Sarah filed her first complaint. Before Voss had reason to want access to HR complaint files. Before there was anything to alter. Merritt had given Voss access to the HR system before the complaints existed, which meant one of two things. Either it was an administrative error made by a department head who hadn't understood the permission scope possible, defensible, the kind of mistake institutions made, or Merritt had known what he was doing and why, and the failure to act on 3 formal complaints had not been the passive negligence of a conflict-averse administrator. It had been something deliberate. Rourke looked at the report. Then, at Sarah. She was looking at the document with the steady, unflinching attention of someone who had trained themselves not to look away from difficult things, who had learned, in circumstances she didn't discuss in hospital corridors or boardrooms, that the most important quality in a high-stakes situation was not courage, exactly, but the willingness to see clearly, even when what you were seeing was worse than you'd prepared for. She looked up. Who else knows about the Merritt authorization? She said. Currently? Polk said. The 3 of us and my analyst. She was quiet for a moment. Okafor needs to know, she said. Before anything else moves. Before Merritt is in another meeting or another corridor or another position where he can touch any part of this. She looked at Polk. Can you get to her in the next 30 minutes? Yes, he said. Then do it, she said. Polk stood, closed the report, and left. Rourke stayed. The room held the particular silence of a situation that had just expanded past its original dimensions and was still in the process of finding its new shape. Outside the window, the city continued its ordinary morning. Inside the building, somewhere below them, Oliver Merritt was in his office, doing whatever Oliver Merritt did at 10:30 on a Thursday, not yet knowing that the terminal access log had just finished running, or that the analysis was complete, or that in approximately 25 minutes, the executive director of the hospital was going to receive a document that would redefine everything that had happened in the past 8 months from administrative failure into something considerably more serious. You knew, Rourke said. She looked at him. Not Merritt specifically, she said. But I knew the complaints didn't just fall through institutional cracks. They were too consistent. The acknowledgement with no follow-up, every time. The way Voss's version always arrived at decision-makers before mine did. She paused. I didn't know the mechanism, but I knew it wasn't just negligence. That's why you documented everything independently. That's why I documented everything independently, she said. He looked at her for a long moment. What do you want the outcome to be? He said. She thought about the woman in room 308, reaching for her hand. About Darlene taking photographs before the mess was cleaned up. About Marcus standing at the main entrance at 6:50 in the morning, waiting for her because he had overheard something in a corridor and made a choice about what to do with it. I want to go back to work, she said. I want the people who altered those documents to be held accountable by a process that has nothing to do with this hospital's internal systems. She paused. And I want the next nurse who files a complaint about someone like Voss to have it treated like what it is. That's not a small ask, Rourke said. No, she said. It isn't. He nodded slowly. And on the floor below them, in an office he would vacate before the end of the day, Oliver Merritt picked up his phone to return a call from a number he recognized, not yet understanding that the call was the last ordinary thing he would do in this building. Call Merritt took at 10:30, last 4 minutes. He didn't know, when he picked up, that Polk was already in the elevator, heading to the executive floor. He didn't know that Okafor had cleared her 10:45 meeting to receive what Polk was bringing her. He didn't know that the terminal access log had finished running 40 minutes ago, or that his name was attached to a system authorization that was, at this moment, being read by 3 people in a room 2 floors above him. He found out at 11:07. Okafor came to his office herself, which was the first signal that what was happening was not a conversation that could be managed at a distance. She brought Whitfield and Polk, which was the second, closed the door behind her, which was the third. Sarah wasn't there. She had been asked by Okafor directly to remain in the second-floor office with Rourke while this part moved forward, not because her presence wasn't warranted, but because Okafor was precise about process and understood that what happened in Merritt's office in the next 40 minutes needed to be documented without variables that a defense attorney could later characterize as coercive. So Sarah sat in the small office and waited. She was not good at waiting, or rather, she was technically excellent at it, had been trained in the specific physical discipline of sustained stillness under pressure, but the internal experience of waiting had never become comfortable. Her mind moved through the architecture of what was happening around her, mapping it, checking it from different angles, looking for the thing she hadn't accounted for. Old habit. The kind that doesn't stop being useful just because the environment has changed. Rourke brought 2 cups of coffee from the machine in the corridor, set one in front of her, sat down across from her. "You're running scenarios," he said. "Yes." "Stop." She looked at him. "It's out of your hands now," he said. Not unkindly, just factually. The access log is documented. The authorization trail is documented. Polk's in that room, and Polk is good at this. You running scenarios in here doesn't change what's happening in there. She looked at the coffee cup. "I know. But you're still doing it." "Yes," she said. He almost smiled. "Fair enough." They sat in the kind of silence that exists between people who have both spent time in situations where silence was a working condition rather than an absence of conversation, not uncomfortable, not filled, just occupying the space evenly while the building moved around them. At 11:53, Whitfield knocked on the door. Her face carried the controlled, professional composure of someone who had just come from a difficult meeting and was managing the residue of it. Stepped inside, closed the door, and looked at Sarah. "Dr. Merritt has been placed on immediate administrative leave, pending a full investigation," she said. He did not contest the documentation. He asked for 15 minutes to call his attorney before saying anything further, and that request was granted. She paused. "He will be escorted from the building within the hour." Sarah held her gaze. "Did he say why he gave Voss access to the HR system?" Whitfield's expression shifted slightly, the involuntary movement of someone who has heard something they found genuinely difficult to process. He said he didn't realize the permission scope included complaint files, that it was a system access grant he made as a general administrative courtesy and didn't understand the implications of. She paused again. "Dr. Okafor's assessment and mine is that this account is not credible given the specificity of the access granted and the timing relative to your first complaint. But he's sticking to it for now. The State Board investigation will pursue it further. Oh, we're not the appropriate venue for determining intent. That's their lane." Whitfield set a folder on the table in front of Sarah. "What I can tell you is that Dr. Okafor has authorized the following: immediate reinstatement of your patient care credentials, formal correction of the complaint file to remove the unauthorized amendments and restore the original documentation, and a written finding from this office that the institutional response to your 3 complaints constituted a failure of duty of care to a staff member." Sarah looked at the folder without opening it. "The written finding goes into the permanent administrative record," Whitfield continued. "Cannot be amended or removed. It will be visible in any future institutional audit." She looked at Sarah steadily. "Dr. Okafor wanted you to know that she pushed for the strongest possible language." "Tell her I appreciate that," Sarah said. Whitfield nodded. She left. 12:30, Oliver Merritt walked out of Kellerman Regional Medical Center, through the staff entrance on the south side of the building, flanked by 2 security officers carrying a single box of personal items from his office. He did not look up as he crossed the parking lot. He did not speak to anyone. 3 nurses from the second floor saw him go from the window of the break room. They didn't cheer. They didn't say much at all. One of them, a woman who had been on staff for 6 years and had filed her own complaint about Voss the previous year. A complaint that had been acknowledged and never acted on, watched until his car left the lot. Then she turned away from the window and went back to work. Word moved through the building in the way it always moved, the informal network, faster than any official announcement, reaching the 3rd floor by 12:45, the ER by 1, the surgical suites by 1:15. The version that traveled was mostly accurate. Merit out. Voss's credentials pulled. State board involved. The nurse from 3rd floor trauma at the center of an investigation that had turned out to be larger than anyone had understood when it started with a cup of coffee on a Tuesday morning. Sarah was back on the 3rd floor by 1:30. She had paperwork to complete reinstatement forms. The formal record correction, a signed statement for Polk's final report, and she did it at the nurse's station with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, working through each document without rushing and without the self-consciousness of someone aware that the floor was watching her in a different way than it had to go. Priya appeared beside her at the station. "You're actually back," she said. "I told you I'd be at 10, Sarah said. "It's 1:30. There was paperwork. Priya looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who had spent 3 days in a state of low-grade anxiety on another person's behalf and was now in the process of releasing it. "Are you okay?" Sarah considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I'm fine. I'd like to check on the patient in 308. "She was asking about you this morning," Priya said. "I know. That's why I want to check on her." She finished the last form, capped her pen, and walked down the corridor toward room 308 with the same pace she always used, not hurried. Not performed, just moving toward the work that needed doing. The patient in 308, whose name was Eloise Martin, was 71 years old and had been confused and frightened on intake 3 days ago. She was clearer now. The disorientation had been partially medication-related and had improved with the adjusted protocol, but she was still in the particular vulnerability of a person who had been reminded by a fall in her own kitchen that the body could betray her without warning. She was not handling that well, which was completely understandable, and she had a way of tracking the faces of the people who came into her room that told Sarah she was measuring trustworthiness in real time with vigilance of someone whose recent experience had made the world feel unreliable. Sarah came in, pulled the chair beside the bed, and sat down rather than standing, the specific choice of someone who was not managing a schedule in this room. "How's the hip?" she said. "Horrible," Eloise said. "Less horrible than yesterday. Still horrible." "That's accurate progress," Sarah said. Eloise looked at her with the sharp-eyed assessment of a woman who had lived long enough not to be easily managed. "You weren't here yesterday afternoon." "No. I had some things to deal with. The business with that doctor." It wasn't a question. Sarah looked at her. "Where did you hear about that?" "The night nurse talks too much," Eloise said, without particular disapproval. "Are you all right?" The question, coming from a 71-year-old woman 3 days post-fracture, who had her own significant problems to manage, landed with a weight that surprised Sarah slightly, not because she was unaccustomed to care from patients, because of the directness of it, the uncomplicated human quality of someone simply asking. "Yes," she said. "I'm all right." Eloise studied her. "You don't look all right. You look like someone who's been through something and is pretending they're fine because they've been trained to pretend they're fine." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "That's probably accurate," she said. Eloise nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already decided. "Sit there for a minute, then. You don't have to talk." So Sarah sat there for 4 minutes, in the chair beside Eloise Martin's bed, while the hospital moved around them, corridors and monitors and the ordinary machinery of a place where people came when the body stopped cooperating and didn't talk. It was, she thought afterward, one of the more honest things that had happened to her in the past 72 hours. The formal announcement from hospital administration came at 3 o'clock in the form of a staff-wide internal communication from Dr. Sandra Okafor. It was specific and it was public, which was Okafor's deliberate choice. She had told Whitfield that the institution's failure had been specific and public, and the correction needed to match it. The communication stated that Dr. Harlan Voss had been terminated from his position at Kellerman Regional Medical Center, effective immediately, following findings of repeated professional misconduct, unauthorized access to administrative systems, physical contact with a colleague in a patient care area, and documentation irregularities currently under review by the Pennsylvania State Medical Board. Stated that Dr. Oliver Merritt had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation of his role in the institutional response to staff complaints. Stated that Kellerman's nursing staff conduct complaint process and was being reviewed and restructured under the oversight of an external HR consultancy, effective within the next 30 days. Did not name Sarah directly. At the end of the communication, in a paragraph that several people on the third floor read twice, Okafor wrote, "This institution failed to adequately respond to formal complaints filed by a member of our nursing staff. That failure had consequences for that individual that were serious, sustained, and preventable. We are not able to undo them. We can commit to not repeating them, and we do." Darlene, who was back on the overnight shift and had come in an hour early, read the communication in the break room and texted Sarah 3 words. They actually said it. Sex, circa. Sarah read it in the corridor outside room 311, paused for 2 seconds, then put her phone in her pocket and went to check on her patient. 3 days after the board meeting, the Pennsylvania State Medical Board issued a formal notice of investigation into Harlan Voss, covering the documentation irregularities identified in Polk's report. The notice was a matter of public record. It appeared within 48 hours in a regional medical trade publication's news. Brief 3 sentences, factual, unembellished, and then in a longer piece in the state's largest newspaper, which had a healthcare reporter who covered the board's investigation notices and had been following the Kellerman story since a source had sent her the text of Okafor's internal communication. The newspaper piece ran on a Wednesday. It named Voss by name. It described the cafeteria incident, the corridor incident, the unauthorized system access, and the altered complaint documents. It described Merritt's administrative leave. It described the naval liaison investigation without identifying Sarah by name, characterizing her only as a third-floor trauma nurse whose formal complaints had not been acted upon. Voss issued a statement through his attorney asserting that he intended to cooperate fully with the state board review and that the reporting contained characterizations he disputed. The state board's investigation moved on its own timeline, unbothered by his statement. Sarah read the newspaper piece on her phone during her lunch break. On Thursday, sitting in the stairwell, the same north stairwell, where she had stood on the 3rd step from the bottom and told Rourke she knew what was coming. She read it twice, the way she read things she needed to fully absorb. And when she finished, she set the phone face down on her knee and looked at the concrete wall across from her. She had expected, when this eventually resolved, and she had always believed it would resolve, which was different from knowing how or when to feel something more dramatic than what she actually felt. Relief, maybe, or satisfaction, or the particular emotional weight of a long-sustained effort finally landing somewhere solid. What she felt was quieter than any of that. It was close to the feeling she'd had in room 308, sitting beside Eloise Martin, and not talking the simple, unperformed acknowledgement that something difficult had ended and something ordinary was available again. Work, her patience, the unremarkable continuity of being somewhere she had chosen to be, doing something that mattered in the specific, unglamorous way that trauma nursing mattered. Not heroically, not in ways that generated recognition, but essentially One person at a time in the small hours, and the hard moments when the difference between the right response and the wrong one was sometimes the entire difference. She picked up her phone, went back to the floor, and spent the afternoon managing a post-surgical case that required 3 medication adjustments and a conversation with a family who was struggling to understand the timeline of their father's recovery. She stayed 20 minutes late to make sure the family had what they needed before she left. Rourke called on a Friday afternoon, 2 weeks after the board meeting. She took the call in the parking garage, leaning against her car in the October cold, watching the sky go gray over the city. Polk's report was filed yesterday, he said. Official findings. It'll be incorporated into the Naval Liaison Command's institutional review database, which means any future naval personnel receiving care at Kellerman will have it in their intake documentation. Is that unusual? She said. A single institution getting that level of notation. It happens when there's a documented failure in the care environment that reached a threshold, requiring formal record, he said, which this did. He paused. The report also includes a commendation notation for the Tuesday intervention. Your name, your clinical assessment, the outcome. She was quiet for a moment. In a classified database. In a classified database, he confirmed, which I recognize is not exactly publicly useful. That's okay, she said. I didn't do it for public. I know you didn't. Another pause, the particular quality of a pause from someone who has something additional to say and is deciding how to say it. There's a position opening in the Naval Special Operations Medical Support Program. Civilian consultant, training and protocol development, trauma curriculum specifically. He let that sit for a moment. It would involve some travel, some classification clearance renewal, and significantly more paperwork than you currently deal with. It would also involve working with operators on pre-deployment trauma response protocols. She looked at the gray sky. Is that an official offer? She said. It's an official notification that the position exists and that your name has been put forward as someone who would be exceptionally qualified, he said carefully. What you do with that notification is entirely your choice. She thought about it. Not in the way of someone who was uncertain, but in the way of someone checking the full weight of a decision before turning it over, looking at what it would require, what it would ask her to become again or stop being. She thought about Eloise Martin's hip fracture, about the 17-year-old from the car accident whose Glasgow score she'd caught dropping before the resident did, about the 47-year-old with the pulmonary embolism who had been scared and angry and had given her 2 minutes of cooperation when she asked for 90 seconds. I appreciate you putting my name forward, she said. I'd like to stay here. He was quiet. At Kellerman, she said. In the trauma unit, she looked at the hospital's exterior, the uninspiring institutional face of it, the loading dock visible from the parking garage, the ambulance bay and its familiar noise. This is where I chose to be. That hasn't changed. Even after everything that happened here, Rourke said. Everything that happened here is why it matters that I stay, she said. Someone has to be here. Someone who knows what the complaints feel like when they go nowhere. Someone who knows what it costs to be the person who keeps filing them anyway. She paused. If I leave, I take that knowledge with me. And the next person who needs someone to show them it's possible to hold the line they're on their own. The silence on his end was long enough that she thought he might be working through a response. Then he said, you know this isn't going to be simple. Even with Voss gone and Merritt gone and the institutional record corrected. Hospitals are what they are. I know, she said. I've always known that. All right, he said. And she heard in it the specific quality of someone who had offered a door and watched another person choose to stay where they were. And who respected that choice even if it wasn't what they'd hoped for. Thank you, Commander, she said. For the verification letter. For Polk. For being in that room. You didn't need me to win that room, he said. No, she said. But you showed up anyway. She heard him exhale almost a laugh, but contained. Care of yourself, Langford. You too, she said. She ended the call and stood in the parking garage for a minute longer, letting the cold air darken at its edge the way October skies do in Sylvania when Pennsylvania, when the light decides it's done for the day. Then she went home. 6 weeks after the cafeteria incident, the third-floor trauma unit had a meeting. Not an administrative meeting. Those happened in conference rooms with agendas and formal minutes. This was the informal kind, convened in the break room at the end of a Tuesday afternoon shift, initiated by Everett, who had been on the unit for 20 years and who had a particular authority that came from duration and consistency rather than title. He made coffee. He pulled chairs in from the corridor. He waited until the full day shift had cycled through, and then he stood in the break room doorway and said simply, "If you've got 5 minutes, come in." 13 people came in. Nurses, 2 techs, a resident who had been on rotation during the past 6 weeks and had asked to stay, which was unusual and which Everett had quietly approved. Darlene was there, which required her to come in 40 minutes early before her overnight shift, which she did without being asked. Sarah sat along the wall. Everett didn't have a speech prepared. He wasn't a speech person. He stood at the front of the break room with his coffee and said, "The past 6 weeks were hard. They were hard in ways that most of us haven't experienced in an institution before. I want to say for the record, in front of everyone here, that I should have pushed harder on those complaints 12 months ago, 8 months ago." He looked around the room. "I didn't. I thought the system would handle it, and it didn't, and that's on me as much as anyone." Nobody told him it wasn't. That would have been dishonest, and they all knew it. And the fact that nobody performed the comfortable denial was something Sarah noticed and appreciated. Going forward, Everett said, "Anyone on this floor files a concern, I'm walking it to the executive level myself. Not routing it, walking it." He looked at the resident in the corner, young, second year, still learning what kind of physician she wanted to be. That includes residents. It includes anyone who comes through here. The resident looked at him steadily. "Okay," she said. Everett nodded. "That's all I had." People started moving, the natural disposal of a room that has done what it came together to do. Chairs scraped. Someone rinsed a cup at the sink. The ordinary texture of the end of a shift. Darlene stopped beside Sarah on her way out. "You okay?" she said. "You keep asking me that," Sarah said. "You keep making it necessary." Sarah looked at her. At the particular face of someone who had shown up, photographed a mess in a cafeteria, texted her news before she could be blindsided by it, simply appeared at the moments that mattered with the uncomplicated practicality of a person who understood that solidarity was not a gesture, but a habit. "Yeah," Sarah said. "I'm okay." Darlene nodded once. Then she went to start her shift. The woman in room 308, Eloise Martin, was discharged on a Thursday, 3 weeks after her admission. Sarah was on shift. She did the discharge paperwork, reviewed the follow-up instructions, went through the medication schedule with Eloise's daughter, who had driven in from Pittston and who had the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone trying to absorb a large amount of medical information in a short window while also managing her own anxiety about her mother's fragility. When the paperwork was done and the transport chair was waiting in the doorway, Eloise reached for Sarah's hand. "I heard what happened," she said, with the doctor, "and all the rest of it." "You hear everything," Sarah said. "I'm old. I have time to pay attention." She held Sarah's hand in both of hers, a firm grip, the hands of a woman who had worked hard her entire life and whose strength had not entirely left them. "They should have listened to you the first time." "Yes," Sarah said. "They should have." "But you stayed anyway." "Yes." Eloise looked at her with the direct, clear-eyed assessment of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between a person performing endurance and a person who had made a genuine choice about what they were willing to carry. "Good," she said. "We need people like you to stay." She let go of Sarah's hand and allowed her daughter to help her into the chair. The door, she looked back once. "Don't let them make you smaller," she said. Sarah met her eyes. "I never did," she said. Eloise smiled, the first full smile Sarah had seen from her in 3 weeks of acquaintance, and her daughter wheeled her out, and the corridor received them, and they were gone. On the last day of October, Harwick Falls woke to the first real cold of the season, the kind that made the city look stripped and clear, the way it always did when autumn finally stopped pretending and committed. Sarah arrived at Kellerman at 6:45. She changed in the locker room, walked the floor before handoff, checked the chart on the new admission in 307 overnight. Complicated history, going to require careful management through the day. Made a note to flag the medication interaction she'd spotted in the preliminary documentation before the attending came through. She was at the nurse's station at 7 when Marcus arrived, unwinding a scarf, cold from the parking garage, carrying 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. He set one beside her without comment. She picked it up. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," he said. They stood at the station in the ordinary morning of a trauma unit, beginning its day, the monitor sounds, the shift, change energy, the low-grade, purposeful movement of people who had work to do and were doing it. Not dramatic, not triumphant, just the unremarkable, essential fact of a floor operating the way it was supposed to operate, with people in it who had chosen to be there. Sarah drank her coffee and looked at the corridor and thought about the strange, non-linear way that things resolved, not the way stories resolved, cleanly and completely. One chapter closing before the next opened, but the way real things resolved, with loose threads still hanging, and some questions still unanswered, and the work continuing regardless, because the work was not contingent on resolution. The work was the point. It had always been the point. Harlan Voss had poured coffee on her head in a room full of witnesses because he had believed, had truly, fundamentally believed, that the quietness of her response to 7 months of harassment was evidence of something small inside her, that the patience was compliance, that the stillness was defeat. He had been wrong about all of it. Not because she was exceptional in any way that required the kind of origin story he'd eventually been confronted with. Not because the Navy or the classified service or the specific history had made her untouchable. Because the thing he had misread as weakness was something he simply hadn't encountered before in the shape it took in her, the disciplined, chosen, completely deliberate decision of a person who understood the difference between absorbing something and being diminished by it. She had never been diminished. She had been waiting. And when the moment came, when the operator arrived on the gurney and the scan was in her hands and the room was watching, she had not needed to announce herself. She had not needed to explain or defend or justify. She had simply done what she was capable of doing, which was, as it turned out, considerably more than anyone in that building had been paying attention to. That was the thing about quiet people. Not all of them, not most of them, but some of them had learned to be quiet because the alternative was spending all their energy on noise, and they needed that energy for something else, for the work, for the patients, for the moment when it finally mattered to be exactly who they were. Everett called the floor to order at 7:08. Handoff began. Sarah set down her coffee, picked up her pen, and listened. Outside the window of the third-floor trauma unit, Harwick Falls went about its morning cold and ordinary, and entirely unaware that anything remarkable had happened inside this building, which was exactly right. Because the remarkable things that happened in hospitals almost never looked remarkable from the outside. They looked like shift changes and medication rounds and nurses standing at chart stations with pens in their hands, doing the invisible, essential, endlessly unglamorous work of keeping people alive. That was what she had come here to do. That was what she was still doing. And no one not a doctor with a paper cup and 11 years of institutional seniority, not an administrator with access to a complaint database, not any version of a system designed to protect the people who already had power at the expense of the people who were simply trying to do their jobs, had managed to change that. She had made sure of it. Not loudly, not dramatically, the way she did everything that mattered, quietly and completely, and without asking anyone's permission to remain exactly who she was.